Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is The Giant Dressed in Grey, Chapter 6, Part 1, The Autumn Campaign in Maryland. General Lee had now decided not to attack the enemy in their strong fortifications around Alexandria, but boldly to carry the war into the enemy's territory or at least into the fertile plains of Maryland. Many advantages, it was hoped, might be secured by this policy. For a considerable period he would be able there to subsist his army, relieved from the necessity of protecting his lines of communication for supplies. The confident belief was also entertained that our army would be increased by 20,000 to 25,000 recruits who were supposed to be only waiting the opportunity of taking up arms against the federal government. Being so reinforced, our commander-in-chief doubted not that he might easily strike a blow against Baltimore or even Washington, or transfer the theater of military operations across the border into the rich agricultural region of Pennsylvania. On the morning of the 5th September, there was again presented throughout the Confederate camps a scene of bustling activity. Every regiment was preparing for the march, officers were riding to and fro, and the long artillery trains were moving off along the turnpike, their rumbling noise combining with the rattle of the drums and the roll of the bugles to wake the echoes for miles around. Our direction was northward, and as we rode onward towards the little town of Leesburg, inspirited by this fact, our horses exhibiting new life from yesterday's repose, many a youthful hero looked forward to this triumphant entry into the federal capital, or to a joyous reception at the hands of the fair women of Baltimore, whose irrepressible sympathies had been always with the South. After a march of several hours, the column reached Leesburg, and the streets of the village were at once so compactly filled with troops, artillery, and wagon trains that General Stuart determined to make a detour with his cavalry, which had been halted about a mile distant, in preference to proceeding through the place. It was necessary, however, for the general to repair for final instruction to the headquarters of General Lee in the town, and in this ride he was accompanied by his staff. Leesburg, the county seat of Loudoun, is a town or village of about 4,000 inhabitants, some 4 miles from the Potomac River, and, as might be readily supposed from its proximity to the border, was alternately in the possession of the Yankees and the Confederates, having undergone a change of masters several times during the war. General Lee's headquarters was set up in the commodious dwelling of a prominent citizen. Jackson and Longstreet had both already arrived there, and our great commander was soon engaged in a council of war with his lieutenants. While this conference was going on, I went across the street with several other members of the staff to partake of an early dinner at the invitation of an old gentleman who lived directly opposite headquarters. Our venerable host had some time before been paralyzed, and now spent the greater part of every day in a cane chair of immense proportions, seated in which he received us. This chair, so big as to resemble rather a summer house or a cottage, came, through the chances of war, to a violent, comico-tragical end. Some months after our visit, during one of the numerous fights that took place around Leesburg, our excellent old friend was seated in his favorite fauteuil, patiently awaiting the result of the conflict, when suddenly a shell crashed through the ceiling of the apartment and, bursting immediately under the chair of cane, tore it to atoms. The attendants, after recovering from their fright, looked around for the mangled remains of its late occupant. Strange to relate, the old gentleman had sustained not the slightest injury and could complain of nothing beyond the somewhat rude manner in which he had been tossed upon the floor. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, we received orders to move on, and after a dusty and very much impeded march of 2 hours, winding through infantry columns and compelled frequently to halt, we reached the Potomac at White's Ford, where the cavalry were to cross. The banks of this noble river, which is of great width at this point, rise to the height of about 60 feet above the bed of the stream, and are overshadowed by gigantic trees of primeval growth, the trunks and branches of which are enwrapped with luxuriant vines that, after reaching the very top, fall in graceful streamers and festoons to the ground, thus presenting tangles of tender verdure rarely seen in the forests of Europe. At White's Ford, the Potomac is divided into two streams by a sandy strip of island in the middle. This island is half a mile in length and offered us a momentary resting place halfway in our passage of it. It was indeed a magnificent sight as the long column of many thousand horsemen stretched across this beautiful Potomac. The evening sun slanted upon its clear placid waters and burnished them with gold, while the arms of the soldiers glittered and blazed in its radiance. There were few moments, perhaps, from the beginning to the close of the war, of excitement more intense, of exhilaration more delightful, than when we ascended the opposite bank to the familiar but now strangely thrilling music of Maryland, My Maryland. As I gained the dry ground, I little thought that in a short time I should recross the river into Virginia under circumstances far different and far less inspiring. The passage of the Potomac by the cavalry column occupied about 2 hours and was attended with some difficulty to our artillery, as the water in many places rose quite up to the middle of the horses' bodies. Having safely accomplished it, we continued our march towards the little town of Poolesville. The inhabitants of Maryland, whom we met along the road, with some exceptions, did not greet us quite so cordially as we had expected, this portion of the state being less devoted than others to the Confederate cause. It was different, however, at Poolesville. We reached this place about nightfall with Fitz-Lee's brigade, but just before entering it, our advance guard had a brisk little engagement with a squadron of Federal cavalry stationed there, which they dispersed by a sudden attack, killing and wounding several and capturing 30 prisoners, with an equal number of horses. We remained in Poolesville about an hour, and in this brief space the enthusiasm of the citizens rose to fever heat. The wildest and absurdest questions were eagerly asked by the honest burghers concerning the strength of our armies, our intended movements, etc., etc. A number of young men became so much excited that they immediately mounted their horses and insisted upon joining our ranks. 2 young merchants of the village, suddenly resolving to enlist in the cavalry, announced their peremptory sale of their extensive stock of groceries upon the spot for Confederate money. Our soldiers cleared out both establishments during the hour to the last pin. Soldiers on such occasions are like children. They buy everything and embarrass themselves with numberless articles which very soon afterwards are thrown away as useless. I myself could not resist the temptation of purchasing a box of cigars, a parcel of white crushed sugar, some lemons, and a pocket knife, in the possession of which treasures I felt as happy as a king. We bivouacked for the night about 2 miles from Poolesville, where we were fortunate enough to get an abundant supply of clover, hay, and Indian corn for our horses. The following day we pushed on to the village of Urbana. On our march thither we saw on the top of an isolated mountain of considerable height, known as the Sugar Loaf, a Yankee signal station, where a company in charge were making signals to some of their colleagues at a distance with great rapidity. A small detachment was immediately sent after these industrious fellows, and speedily returned, bringing with them several officers and men, and an entire apparatus of beautiful instruments. We entered Urbana about noon. Around this place the cavalry had orders to encamp. My own instructions from General Stuart were to establish his headquarters and afterwards to seek him at the headquarters of Jackson, who had bivouacked near the town of Frederick, 8 miles farther on, having crossed the Potomac at fords higher up than the point of our passage, and by a forced march outstripped us by this distance. Urbana is a pretty village of neat white houses situated halfway between Poolesville and Frederick in the midst of a smiling and prosperous country. The simple arrangements for our headquarters were quickly made. A few tents were pitched in the garden of a modest dwelling in the very center of the village. The horses were picketed around, and in a few minutes the smoke rising from a dozen or more campfires gave pleasing assurance that the Negroes were busy with their kettles in the occupation of all others most suited to their genius and temper, the preparation of dinner. Unfortunately, I could not wait to profit by the results of their culinary talent, and before my comrades of the staff had commenced their meal, I was trotting along the broad turnpike towards Frederick. This town, which has a population of about 15,000, occupies a charming site in one of the most fertile valleys of Maryland and is approached from Poolesville by a road lined on either side by rich estates whose mansions are built round with the green verandas of the South. At the point where the road sweeps suddenly down from a higher elevation to the vale of the Monocacy, the view is really grand. Well-tilled fields stretch away for miles to purple ranges of mountains in the far distance. In the middle of the plain lies the city with its domes and steeples, and in the intermediate space flows the brawling, limpid stream of the Monocacy, spanned by lofty bridges and the noble viaduct of the Baltimore and Ohio Railway. Frederick was a depot of supplies for the Federal Army during the war, and in a strategical point of view was a place of considerable importance. Jackson's corps had taken the town completely by surprise, and a portion of the troops stationed there had been captured, besides 2 hospitals containing several hundred wounded men and immense stores of medicines, provisions, and equipments. As General Stuart, always uncertain in his movements, was not at Jackson's headquarters and was supposed to have gone into the town, I determined to ride there myself in the hope of finding him. Entering the good old city of Frederick, I found it in a tremendous state of excitement. The Unionists living there had their houses closely shut up and barred, but the far greater number of the citizens, being favorably disposed to the Confederate cause, had thrown wide open their doors and windows and welcomed our troops with the liveliest enthusiasm. Flags were floating from the house, and garlands of flowers were hung across the streets. Everywhere a dense multitude was moving up and down, singing and shouting in a paroxysm of joy and patriotic emotion. In many cases partly superinduced by an abundant flow of strong liquors. Every officer who wore a plume in his hat was immediately taken for Jackson or Stuart. All averments to the contrary, all remonstrances to the crowd were utterly useless. The public would have it their own way. So it happened that I was very soon followed by a wild mob of people of all ages, from the old greybeard down to the smallest boy, all insisting that I was Jackson, and venting their admiration in loud cheers and huzzas. Ladies rushed out of their houses with bouquets. In vain did I declare that I was not Jackson. This disclaimer, they said, was prompted by the well-known modesty of the great hero, and afforded them the surest means of recognizing him. The complication grew worse and worse every minute. To escape these annoying ovations, I dismounted at last at a hotel, but here I was little better off. It was like jumping into the mill pond to get out of the rain. The proprietor of the establishment being a German, many of Germania's sons were there assembled, immersed in beer and smoking like so many furnaces. I am quite sure that most of them were very decided Yankee sympathizers, but as a grey uniform was right among them, and many others were not far off, they talked the hottest secession and nearly floored me with their questions. One, who had seen Jackson's columns on the march, affirmed they numbered not a man less than 300,000. Another was only in doubt as to the day and hour when we should victoriously enter Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. All were sure that 30,000 Marylanders were ready to follow in the next few days our invincible army, a large proportion of whom were at that moment in Frederick, waiting only for arms, etc., etc. I was exceedingly glad to break away from all this and get back to Urbana, there to rest my weary limbs on the soft carpet of grass at headquarters. As it was evident that we should be stationed at Urbana for some days, General Stuart, in order to establish a regular line of outposts, separated the different brigades of his command. Fitzlee's was sent to the little town of Newmarket, about 10 miles off. Robertson's, under Colonel Munford, was ordered to the neighborhood of Sugarloaf Mountain, while Hampton's remained in the immediate vicinity of Urbana. The following morning we were waited upon by the dignitaries of the place and received an invitation for dinner from a Mr. C, with whom and his pleasant family we soon became intimately acquainted. There were several very charming and pretty young ladies staying at Mr. C.'s house, and among them one from New York, a relation of the family on their visit to Urbana, whom General Stuart, from her warm, outspoken Confederate sympathies, jokingly called the New York Rebel. In the agreeable conversation of these ladies, in mirth and song, The afternoon of our dinner party passed lightly and rapidly away, and then came night, queenly and beautiful, with a round moon, whose beams penetrating the windows suggested to our debonair commander a promenade, which he at once proposed, and which was carried nem. con. Leaving to our fair friends the choice of their partners, we were guided by them to a large building, crowning the summit of a gentle hill on the edge of the village, from which a broad avenue of trees sloped downwards to the principal street. This building had been occupied before the breaking out of the war as an academy, but was now entirely deserted and dismantled, and our footsteps echoed loudly as we walked through its wide empty halls, once so noisy with human voices. Each story of the house had its ample veranda running around it, and from the highest of these we had a magnificent view of the village and the surrounding country. The night was calm, the dark blue firmament was besprinkled with myriads of stars, and the moon poured over all the landscape a misty bluish light that made it all look unreal. One might have thought it a magical scenic effect of the theatre, or been carried back in imagination to the 1001 Nights of Eastern fable, had not the campfires of our troops and the constant neighing of the horses reminded him of the realities by which he was surrounded. We were indulging in the dreamy sentiment natural to the hour when the gay voice of Stuart broke in. "Major, what a capital place for us to give a ball in honor of our arrival in Maryland. Don't you think we could manage it?" To this there was a unanimous response in the affirmative, which was especially hearty on the part of the ladies. It was at once agreed that the ball should be given. I undertook to make all necessary arrangements for the illumination and decoration of the hall, the issuing of cards of invitation, etc., leaving to Stuart the matter of the music, which he gladly consented to provide. A soldier's life is so uncertain and his time is so little at his own disposal that in affairs of this sort delays are always to be avoided, and so we determined on our own way home, to the great joy of our fair companions, that the ball should come off on the following evening. There was great stir of preparation at headquarters on the morning of the 8th. Invitations to the ball were sent out to all the families in Urbana and its neighborhood and to the officers of Hampton's brigade. The large halls of the academy were aired and swept and festooned with roses and decorated with battle flags borrowed from the different regiments. At 7 in the evening all was complete, and already the broad avenue was filled with our fair guests, proceeding to the scene of festivity according to their social rank and fortune, some on foot, others in simple light rockaways, others again in stately family coaches, driven by fat Negro coachmen who sat upon the box with great dignity. Very soon the sound of distant bugles announced the coming of the band of the 18th Mississippi Infantry, the colonel and staff of the regiment, who had been invited as an act of courtesy, leading the way, and the band playing in excellent style the well-known air of Dixie. Amid the loud applause of the numerous invited and uninvited guests, we now made our grand entrée into the large hall, which was brilliantly lighted with tallow candles. As master of these ceremonies, it was my office to arrange the order of the different dances, and I had decided upon a polka as the best for an animated beginning. I had selected the New York Rebel as the queen of the festival, and had expected to open the ball with her as my partner, and my surprise was great indeed when my fair friend gracefully eluded my extended arms and with some confusion explained that she did not join in round dances, thus making me uncomfortably acquainted for the first time with the fact that in America, and especially in the South, young ladies rarely waltz except with brothers or first cousins, and indulge only in reels and contre dances with strangers. Not to be baffled, however, I at once ordered the time of the music to be changed, and had soon forgotten my disappointment as to the polka in a very lively quadrille. Louder and louder sounded the instruments, quicker and quicker moved the dancers, and the whole crowded room, with its many exceedingly pretty women and its martial figures of officers in their best uniforms, presented a most striking spectacle of gaiety and enjoyment. Suddenly enters an orderly covered with dust, and reports in a loud voice to General Stuart that the enemy have surprised and driven in our pickets and are attacking our camp in force. while at the same moment the sound of shots in rapid succession is distinctly borne to us in the midnight air. The excitement which followed this announcement I cannot undertake to describe. The music crashed into a Concordia discourse. The officers rushed to their weapons and called for their horses. Panic-stricken fathers and mothers endeavored in a frantic way to collect round them their bewildered children, while the young ladies ran to and fro in most admired despair. General Stuart maintained his accustomed coolness and composure. Our horses were immediately saddled, and in less than 5 minutes we were in rapid gallop to the front. Upon arriving there we found, as is usually the case in such sudden alarms, that things were by no means so desperate as they had been represented. Colonel Baker, with the splendid 1st North Carolina Regiment, had arrested the bold forward movement of the Yankees. Pelham, with his guns in favorable position, was soon pouring a rapid fire upon their columns. The other regiments of the command were speedily in the saddle. The line of battle having been formed, Stuart gave the order for a general attack, and with great rage and fury we precipitated ourselves upon the foe, who paid, with the loss of many killed and wounded, and a considerable amount of prisoners, for their unmannerly interruption of our social amusement. They were pursued in their headlong flight for several miles by the 1st North Carolina, until, a little past midnight, they got quite out of reach and all was quiet again. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning when we got back to the academy, where we found a great many of our fair guests still assembled, awaiting with breathless anxiety the result of the conflict. As the musicians had never dispersed, General Stuart ordered them again to strike up. Many of our pretty fugitives were brought back by young officers who eagerly volunteered for that commendable purpose, and as everybody was determined that the Yankees should not boast of having completely broken up our party, the dancing was resumed in less than half an hour, and kept up till the first glimmer of dawn. At this time, the ambulances laden with the wounded of last night's engagement were slowly approaching the academy as the only building at Urbana that was at all suited to the purpose of an hospital. Of course, the music was immediately stopped and the dancing ceased, and our lovely partners in the quadrille at once became ministering angels to the sufferers. Captain Blackford and I went down with our New York rabble to an ambulance in which there was a poor fellow fearfully wounded by a ball in the shoulder. His uniform jacket was quite saturated with blood, and the tender white hands of our charming friend had just become fairly employed in the compassionate office of stanching the wound and cooling the inflammation with applications of cold water, when her strength broke down and she fainted away. When after a few minutes she was recovered, we did our best to persuade her to go home, but with a courage equaling that of the warrior on the field of battle, she replied, "I must first do my duty." This she did bravely and tenderly, until the wounded man, greatly relieved by her ministrations, expressed his gratitude with tears streaming from his eyes, and begged her now to take care of herself. Blackford and I accompanied the noble creature to the house of Mr. C, and left her with the higher admiration for her tenderness and fortitude. The sun was high in the heavens when we rose from our camp pallets the following day. The soldier's slumber was naturally profound after the fatigues and adventures of a night when the ballroom had been so quickly deserted for the battlefield, and sanguinary conflict had in a moment succeeded to the dance. My first duty was to send back to the respective regiments their battle flags, and I made all haste to discharge it. For once, our troops had been called into action without their colors, and already many anxious inquiries had been instituted as to their safety. General Stuart and myself were invited to dine with the doctor of the place, at whose pleasant dwelling we passed a few hours most delightfully. The universal veranda looked out upon the same beautiful landscapes that we had admired from other points, and afforded us a cool retreat for cigars and conversation. I became very much interested here with a young vagabond Indian about 14 years of age, who was pertinacious in his efforts to sell me a pet grey squirrel which he had tamed. As the fellow seemed homeless and masterless, I had some idea of taking him along with me as a servant, and perhaps might have done so but for the earnest remonstrances of General Stuart, who, from his life in the prairie, was well acquainted with the Indian character, and knew only too well what incorrigible thieves the redskins always prove. At a late hour of the afternoon, the air was startled by the thunder of distant cannon, and we soon received a report from General Fitz-Lee that he had been engaged in a brisk skirmish with the enemy's cavalry near the village of Barnesville. This, however, did not prevent us from spending the evening with our fair friends at Mr. C's, nor from paying them the compliments of a serenade. But the time of inactivity for us was now soon to be over. Urbana was not to be our capital, and the second day afterwards we bade adieu to what a punning member of the staff called its Urbanities with regret. One day more of rest at headquarters, the 10th, which gave some occupation, however, to Robertson's brigade at Sugarloaf Mountain, where Colonel Munford engaged the Yankees in a sharp but unimportant skirmish. On the morning of the 11th, we received marching orders. The aspect of military affairs had undergone a sudden but great change. General McClellan, who had again been entrusted by the federal government with the command of the Army of the Potomac, had collected together the remains of the army of the unfortunate Pope and been largely reinforced by Burnside's corps from North Carolina, the troops around Washington, and the new levies. With a well-equipped and formidable force, he hurried forwards to the relief of the garrison at Harper's Ferry, which stronghold had been closely invested by Jackson. General Lee, with Longstreet's corps, had left the vicinity of Frederick and was slowly retreating in the direction of Middletown and Boonesborough. The cavalry, as the rearguard of our army, had orders to retreat and embarrass as much as possible the forward movement of the enemy and to follow slowly the road taken by General Lee. The fighting of the preceding 2 days had occurred with the cavalry of McClellan, which was a full day's march ahead of the main body of his army. A steadily falling rain, which gave us some discomfort in the saddle, added much to the dejection of spirits with which we got in readiness to move away from Urbana. About 11 a.m. Fitz-Lee's brigade passed through the village on its way to Frederick. Hampton's soon followed, and only Robertson's, under command of Colonel Munford, remained behind, covering the retreat and holding in check at a distance of about 5 miles from the place the rapid advance of the Yankee cavalry. Meanwhile, I was kept riding to and fro, directing the retreat in the name of the general who, with the other members of the staff, to my intense disgust, still lingered in the veranda with the ladies. About 2 p.m., our brave horsemen were pressed back by overwhelming numbers at a point not more than half a mile from the village. The crack of the carbines was distinctly audible, and several shells aimed too high, exploding just around the mansion, made it clear that the final moment of separation had indeed arrived. Great excitement now prevailed among the ladies, so soon to be again in the power of the detested Yankees, who, they had too much reason to fear, would punish severely the kindness and hospitality they had shown us. As for Mr. C, he at once determined to ride off with us, and so we galloped out of the village in the direction of Frederick amid the tears of women and children who stood waving handkerchiefs to us as long as we were in sight. 10 minutes later, Urbana was in the hands of the enemy. Having crossed the Monocacy, we took up a new position on the opposite bank of that river. As the enemy did not advance that day beyond Urbana, the greater part of our cavalry encamped between that point and Frederick. About half a mile from the latter place, we fixed our headquarters at the farmhouse of an old Irishman who amused us very much with his beautiful brogue, and with whose pretty daughters, spirited Irish girls they were, we had a lively little dance at night. Early the next day, September the 12th, our scouts and patrols reported the enemy slowly advancing in strong force on the turnpike from Urbana, and we received orders to retreat through Frederick over the mountains of Middletown, but to retard the Federal column as long as possible at Monocacy Bridge, which was to be burned at the last moment. As they were moving so slowly that at 2 p.m. their advance guard was not yet in sight, General Stuart rode with his staff to Frederick, where we had been invited by several prominent citizens to dine. The appearance of the city had greatly changed since I had last seen it. The patriotic frenzy had completely subsided and given place to an oppressive anxiety. Most of the houses were shut up, and the inhabitants, with sorrowful faces, were wandering about the streets, credulous of every idle rumor and asking at every corner the most ridiculous questions. Such of them as sympathized with the enemy could ill conceal their satisfaction at his approach, and one of these, a Mr. F, was impudent enough to hoist a Union flag from the flat roof of his 3-story house, where he might be seen making with it undeniable signals. Very much provoked at this treasonable conduct, I posted 2 of our best marksmen on the opposite side of the street, sending at the same time my best compliments to Mr. F, with the message that I had given my men orders to shoot him if for a minute longer he continued his offensive course. Federal ensign and ardent Yankee sympathizer now disappeared very rapidly together, but I have every reason to believe that later in the day, when we were compelled to leave the city in some haste, he expressed his thanks to me in a charge of buckshot, which rattled from the front door of his house around my head. Don't you just hate it when you conduct a grand ball with fair maidens in the middle of a war, and the enemy just then attacks, thereby crashing the festivities? How rude! Anyway, quite the occasion to be merry, I'd say, and our man and his general can be glad that it did not bite them in the backside. Funnily enough, when researching the primary sources of this time frame, depending on who you ask, the nice townsfolk of Frederick, Maryland were extremely friendly and glad every single time either army retook the city, regardless of which army it was. That's quite remarkable. Furthermore, like I said, I learn something new every time I read about this conflict. I wasn't aware that General Lee's entire plan of attack was compromised in the most random way possible. As it turns out, a copy of Lee's written movement order was used as packing material for cigars and just left behind in a field. There, they were found by a random Union corporal who immediately sent it up the chain. General McClellan recognized the significance of it. However, instead of immediately acting upon the intelligence gained, he decided to write a gleeful letter to President Lincoln and to wait 18 hours. Either way, when he finally did change his plan of action, General Lee instantly recognized that something was up, as he also had received counterintelligence from a Confederate sympathizer indicating that his plans had been revealed. So you see, decisive action must be taken immediately for it to have any kind of effect. If you don't, you may waste precious time and lose the initiative. But the Virginia campaign is the main focus of our man, and we will find out how it works out for him in the next episode. Cheers.